What's up, future shredlords? Welcome back. Death to the fingers. We're going to be carrying on with the chord stuff here. Essentially, this little series on the CAGED system and maximizing the CAGED system, learning how to use that in a real-world context on the fretboard. But that first improv there at the beginning, that was for someone on the Twitters that was asking if I could sort of do a real-world improv with respect to practicing fast or playing fast or whatever it is. Listen, the thing is just try to relax. Try to use the rules of superimposition, meaning you could pair things up like Mixolydian and Ionian. So you start to move between those two scale systems simultaneously. And when you start doing stuff like that, you just break down a lot of walls. And of course, you start to identify the problems in your playing. You're like, my stamina's not very good. And, you know, or my accuracy is, you know, for the birds or whatever it is, right? Hammer-ons and pull-offs actually do play a massive role in alternate picking, so don't skip over that one. Plus also hand strength and dexterity and whatnot. Another couple big ones that have nothing to do with the alternate picking aspect, but that's obviously a big one too. Relaxing your wrist, position, controlling string noise. All these things have to come into play. Obviously, familiarity is going to breed speed. So if you practice something a lot, you'll get fast at it because you just get familiar with it. And that's a big one. But the point being here is it's also speed of mind, moving between the techniques, moving between the systems, moving between keys, moving between methodologies like scales or chords or arpeggios. This is also a big part of it. So when you're doing stuff to practice being fast, it's not just about playing fast on the fretboard. It's about joining ideas together quickly too. And sort of intricate little runs that have a certain connecting flow to them that's pre-planned. It's not totally random. There is a certain measure of randomness how it comes out because you're just like, well, I have no idea. I'm just going to kind of do this weird sequence and then you just go from there. But, you know, the actual connecting of the positions together, well, that's actually a lot more thought out. You're like, oh, look, I'm in this particular position, Aeolian. I can do this now. Right? Minor 7, flat 5, or minor 7, or whatever it is, and exploit that. And that's where the real magic starts to come in, is you can actually start to see these positions. So the chord thing here, just to wrap up this intro and get into that, is this is the sort of intermediary step, right? Between sort of understanding that you can take a major scale and then just expand it out onto one string, and then start playing each one of those scale degrees with triads and get these big 6-string chords. Nice, I can barely get it out here. And as you move up each scale degree, you get like a different tonality: major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished, and then you're back to the start again. Right? But then you can start to manipulate those chords too. Instead of just getting a major triad, you can get major 7 or major 9 or major 11. Right? And that's true for 1, 4, or 5. Or you can get dominant 7 or minor 7, flat 5, and there's all kinds of substitutions, but it starts at the low level. So now you can use that information. So we use the key of E major in this case, and we have been working in the key of E major. And essentially what we're doing is using small fragments of the E major triad, and we're combining that by ascending up, of course, diatonically. In this case, on the A string, with the D string and the G string as the scale, as the chord fragment, right, from the E type, from the CAGED system. Now listen, if you're struggling with that, you need to beef up on what CAGED means. So when I said E type, that means you're doing a big bar chord where you're barring your whole first finger across all 6 strings, right? You're kind of making a power chord and whatnot. That's an E type chord because it's based on this big, huge E chord that you would normally play in the open position. Right, so that's why it's the E type. And that actually defines a region on the guitar as well, right? When it's down there like that, well, that's the Ionian position. But I also know now the G type is branched off it too, so on and so forth. So the system in and of itself is a map of the fretboard, but for chords. And that could be very, very useful because I can use that system that's already optimized for chords rather than using 3 notes per string, which is going to be optimized for scales. See what I mean? So you have to practice both of these things in sort of that context. In this one here, I'm using 3 notes per string and the classical method and all that good stuff and probably arpeggios too, of course, to work on dexterity with single note stuff and chaining that together. But over here now I'm doing like, you know, multiple notes at the same time, creating small chords or big chords and whatnot, and trying to control string noise and just break down the fretboard in exactly the same way. And that's just it. The CAGED system lets you do that. When you're talking about the A-type chord, well, that's right around the mixolydian position, starting on the A string, right? When we're talking about the C-type chord, well, even though it starts essentially again in the mixolydian position, it's more sort of situated in the Lydian and Phrygian positions. So once you start to understand that, you're like, this chord here actually occupies a region. You can then use that for 3 notes per string for the arpeggio systems. And now, of course, these chords and their inversions. And that's a starting position. And you can, of course, just apply diatonic scale theory to start the sequence from wherever you are on that particular chord. And there it is. This is some of the most important stuff there is when it comes to music. And you'll hear me do some pretty cool stuff with just adding 1 note to the chord sequence that takes it from being like, yeah, it was pretty cool, to like, damn, it almost sounds like jazz. And there it is. That's the mindset you start to get into, is explore this idea now with these 2 systems where I have this triad, but I also have 3 notes per string, effectively on just 1 string though. So if I play the triad and then I add in this extra note that's the next one in the sequence from the note that I'm playing in the triad, boom, I've just unlocked a whole new level with respect to the guitar. So let's get into this bad boy. All right, no biggie here. It's essentially just the basic information you need to know. The scale, and then, of course, the CAGED system based around the scale that you just did. And I just did 1 position there, the major, right, from the 1st degree. So if I was doing Dorian, it'd be minor. If I was doing Phrygian, it'd be minor as well, right? If I moved to Lydian and Mixolydian major. Aeolian's minor. Locrian is going to be diminished, and then back to major again. So that is very important. Yes, of course, you can manipulate each one of those chords in every one of those positions whenever there's a group of 3 to yield all the other ones. So you could go from major to minor, then from minor to diminished, or you could go from major to augmented. That's another one. So you get 4 triads there, and you should know how to basically do that conversion. But this information here, where you're just like fleshing out the key, and then all of a sudden building the CAGED system around the 1st degree in this case, which is what we're going to be working with, the Ionian mode. That right there is got to be job number 1. And of course, the next step would be like do it when it's in Dorian. So you play the Dorian mode as the scale, and then you do the same sequence with the CAGED system with minor triads. Then you'd move to the Phrygian mode. You would play the Phrygian 3 notes per string, or more likely the classical method before, of course, yes, doing another series of minor triads and so on and so forth until you get through all 7 of them. Done deal. But that was the major, so that starts you off. Let's get into this next section. All right, that's what I call a fundamental exercise. Basically, you have to do stuff like that with the open E string, the A string, the D string. Practice it a lot. Just start getting good at the modal substitution and stuff like that to keep it fresh. But practicing those chord shapes, the finger transitions, visualizations on the fretboard, and all the rest of that stuff, I can't even begin to stress how important that is in terms of, later development, especially in terms of just getting around the fretboard quickly, which is an essential element necessary for you to build up like ridiculous levels of speed if you want to play fast, or even put ideas together quickly. Not necessarily play fast, but basically chain together a whole bunch of really cool, short, and intricate ideas, right? So the thing here is you got to practice essentially climbing up and descending down with the diatonic scale system using these triad fragments. Of course, using E makes a lot of sense because it's very simple and straightforward. But the big takeaway is the A there, the open A. Well, that's the fourth degree of the E major scale. That makes it Lydian. And 1 and 4, those things play well together as far as music is concerned, right? The music theory. So that must mean that I can now layer the chords of E major with this open A. And now I get this kind of Lydian overtone. So it's a really sort of simple way of getting a cool flavor without actually trying to reinvent the wheel type deal, right? So again, you're using the C-type chords from the CAGED system to represent all those E major chords, right? Major, minor, and diminished. Just again, climbing up diatonically, no big deal, but incredibly powerful tool. And last but not least, of course, is the idea that you can now, of course, substitute in, say, an open B if you have a 7th string. That's the 5th degree. That would give you like Mixolydian overtones, right? 1, 4, 5. Those chords, they all work well together. They create cadences, the plagal cadence, 1 to 4, the perfect cadence, 1 to 5, or 5 to 1, doesn't matter which way you go, right? That stuff there is why you're like, okay, well, even from like a scale perspective, they work. Yes. This part of music and this part over here of music, those two things work well together. Think of it that way. Break it down into 7 regions. These 2 regions, they work real well together. So you can use that to your advantage. Right? And that's really what you're talking about now is borrowing just that note for the bass note, but then of course layering all the chords from the scale that you're working in, that it's sympathetic, it's essentially synergetic with. So there it is. You get to use that now as a tool. And of course you can do it again with respect to the Mixolydian position. And you could just, like I said, get good at the modal interplay. Once you start moving some of these chords around, you'll start finding all the sweet chords that are alternatives to other chords. And that, which we will look at in the next video, is an insanely useful skill because you're like, man, I can substitute out this boring minor chord that is so predictable for this exciting, fresh, and interesting major chord or combination thereof. And it just takes the music over the top and to the next level, right? So these exercises cannot be skipped over. We just did the major scale. We're going to look at some next lesson where we do the modal ones too. But this one right here, the major one, obviously is a must on all sets of strings. You see me do the E types there. Then you see me, of course, using the D types. I'm also using the C types, but you have to know them all. Done. Let's get into the improv. All right, there's the improv. Nothing special. Essentially, you see me do the basic stuff. I do the 5-1 perfect cadence at the end there, setting up that B7 by playing the D sharp diminished and then layering in the B. So obviously, if you're playing the diminished chord and then you layer in the 5th degree of the key that you're working in. So in this case, we're working in E major, so D sharp diminished is the 7th degree of E major. So if I layer in the note B, the 5th degree, and I play that over top of the diminished, the 7th degree, I will get the dominant 7 chord. Nails it. So obviously that dominant 7 chord sets up perfectly the movement to go back to the root. That is some basic music theory stuff that I think people skip over. Notice how I didn't just go diminished and then right to major. I used some very simple music theory to accomplish a sophisticated goal, which was set the chord up that I want to move to. So by adding in the B7, it now properly sets up the movement for me to now move to the E major again. Done. Rule number 2 here, obviously, when you're doing these free play exercises is don't just play like the obvious chord stuff. Now, you can immediately see I start to use E major 7. There's an A major 9 in there somewhere. There's a couple other sophisticated chords. Now, listen, I'm doing that because that's what I'm comfortable with. That's what I'm practicing. But in your case, you might have to dumb it down to just those simple triad fragments, but start moving them around so that they're more played in intervallic schemes rather than just up and down one at a time, right? You're now going to do these leaps where you start to jump over 2 or 3 positions, go from the 1st degree all the way up to the 4th degree kind of deal. So, you know, that's also important. And another big one is of course, is when I do the sequence with respect to the open A string, and of course I'm just layering in these E major triads, you see me substitute in that one note. And that right there is an incredibly important exercise. It's the idea that now you're playing this chord, this triad, and there's another note there that sort of is the next note in the sequence of 3 notes per string, essentially, right? But that note also sets up the transition to move to the next chord. So it's kind of hard to encapsulate that idea by just using theory, but once you hear it, you're like, that one note makes it sound slightly more cooler to move to the next chord afterwards. It sort of gives it like this energy to propel it forward. So again, working on things like that. And at one point in time, you were like, well, that one note, couldn't I turn that into another triad? Yes, you could, either borrowed from a sympathetic key, or you can play diminished or dominant 7 or something like that. And then all of a sudden, you're really, you know, starting to get into complicated territory. But it's absolutely true, right? But it starts off with this idea that you're just going to climb up diatonically and now layer in this extra one note to smooth out, if you will, the transition, what we call voice leading. And there it is. Now listen, the trial and error part of actually being able to do some of this stuff for yourself and play the more challenging chord sequences and whatnot, that's on you. There's no lesson I can give you. It doesn't make any sense for me to sit here and be like, okay, put your fingers here and stuff like that. Instead of trying to play more complicated chords, instead take the simple chords and try to make them sound cool, but in an improvisation by just moving them around. And trust me, you can do that by just bouncing between the open E and the open A string by getting the sequence right. So it's not a question of complexity. It's a question of ingenuity. Are you committed to actually layering these chord sequences together in such a way that they work? Can you do that? Set yourself a few, simple parameters. I'm going to start here one time with the open string on the, the low E, and then another chord with the low E. That sets up me moving to the one where I'm going to play now the open A. And then I'm going to play another chord with respect to the open A. Now, a lot of people might be like, move to the open D. You can't do that, obviously, in the key of E major, because D is not actually inherent to the key, is it? You'd need to move to B. And if you don't have 7 strings or 8, you're kind of up the creek. So you got to be careful there. Now, of course, you can change the key. You can play the key of G major. Well, now, you know, when you're doing stuff like that, you got to think of E major now as E minor, right? That's a 6th degree. But the same principles will apply. I play the E minor, I move up a whole step, and I'm going to play the E-type's diminished variant. And then I'm going to move up a half step again, relative to the root note, obviously, and get my major position. Then I'm just going to keep moving through the scale. Done deal, right? But of course, the root now is going to be based around the G. But the A there, that gives you the Dorian stuff, so you can layer the A now over the G major chords. That's going to be relatively sympathetic, right? And D obviously is the 5. So again, you could do the D with the G chords on the top 3 strings. You start to see that it actually becomes like a little math problem. You're like, I have this open A. What can I do with that? What sequence of chords can I layer over top of it if I'm working in the key of G major, right? And there it is, kind of deal. You might be like, oh, I can do A minor. I could do all the inversions of just A minor. Instead of doing it all diatonically, do the inversions of just the A minor triad across all the strings. So now you're, starting to combine the idea of the diatonic stuff with just the inversions, right? Just staying in A minor the whole time rather than going from A minor to move through the different positions of the diatonic scale. So again, the free play thing gives you the opportunity to just slow stuff down and sit there and think about it and then work through your idea. I had to sit there for about, 10 takes before I really kind of solidified something that sounded half decent. And then I got lucky by, just recording that one. And again, it's not about perfection. It's about just getting your ideas out there and working on something that makes sense from a musical perspective. It's not just dogmatically adhering to a bunch of nonsense. What you're playing is something that you could just pick up a guitar and play, and people would be like, damn, man, that guy can play, man. Now listen, that A sequence that I do that sounds pretty musical and pretty badass is not that hard. So almost anybody can play that with a bit of skill. So there it is. There's the video. I think we're finished. We're going to get into the modal ones, doing the same basic principle again, using the open strings and whatnot, combining them together now to get even more complex ideas and sort of more applications. But this one right here obviously is the most important. Just being able to move through the stuff with the major and really putting the miles on with this one particular system, the Ionian, is going to be massively beneficial to any musician. It's only the people that are really super into music that need to expand beyond Ionian into, obviously, the next one. Aeolian is going to be the next biggest, but then, of course, all the other ones after that. Diminished is not really, you know what I mean? It's not really something that you're going to be diving into as far as this kind of an exercise is concerned. Now, listen, you can play a bunch of diminished stuff, but try to concentrate on diminished and dominant 7 as being something that you use as a transitionary element. So you move from one chord to dominant 7 or diminished, and then move to the next target chord that you're sort of aiming for, either in the same key or in a new key. That's a lot more sensical than just being like, oh, play a bunch of diminished chords all over the place, because you're not getting that much value. I think you already know. Listen to some Yngwie Malmsteen. You'll know what diminished sounds like when it's just played in the same key all the time, right? It's a lot more powerful than that, and it's more of a leaping off tool than it is just to sort of exploit endlessly. So there it is. I think I'm all done now. Practice the free stuff, and then essentially try to come up with your own ideas, then factor in new and more complex chord forms. And then, of course, start to use dominant 7 and diminished to now transfer into new keys. So you're starting off with E major, but then you're going to be like, oh, I'm going to transfer to a sympathetic key, E minor, G major now. Or maybe you're going to jump into A major. Done. We'll see you in the next one.